Okay, good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here and to talk about some research that I started in Giulio Tononi's lab at the University of Wisconsin during my postdoc, and that I continue now in Lausanne in Switzerland. So needless to say, when we are awake, we're always conscious. In a phenomenological sense, we all know what it is like to see a particular image, to smell a particular smell, to have an emotion, or to think a thought. Now, sleep is the only physiological state in which consciousness can totally disappear, because at some moments in sleep, we do not have any experience at all. And then sleep is also a state in which conscious experiences can reappear in the form of dreams. When we dream, we see things, we hear things, we have emotions, we can think. So in a phenomenological sense, we have experience during sleep. And the important point here is that the experience is real. It's an experience of an imaginary world, of course, but the experience in itself is real. And that's why we consider that sleep is actually a state where consciousness can re-emerge. Of course, when we dream, we're never conscious of being conscious. We don't have this metacognition. We don't realize that we are in our bed sleeping. But we have consciousness in the sense that we have experience. And because sleep is a recurrent phenomenon that occurs in everyone, it really allows us to compare what happens in the brain or what changes in the brain between when we're conscious and when we're unconscious. And the good thing is that it allows us to do in a clean way, in the sense that when we compare consciousness and unconsciousness during sleep, subjects do not have to perform a task. In fact, by definition, they cannot perform tasks because during sleep we're disconnected from the environment, as we heard yesterday. So you don't have any confounding factors related to the fact that you have to perform a task. And the other advantage is that you can compare consciousness and unconsciousness within the same state, that is sleep. And this is different from when we compare, for example, wakefulness with anesthesia or wakefulness with coma, where yes, consciousness changes, but many other things with it as well. So in other words, it allows us to study the neural correlates of consciousness in sleep. Now, what do we know about the neural correlates of consciousness in sleep? Now, when Rem sleep was discovered in the 1950s, the answer to this question seemed relatively straightforward. So Azarinsky and Kleitman, who first saw Rem sleep in humans, or described Rem sleep in humans, were quick to notice that when you woke up subjects in the stage and asked them, did you just have a dream? Well, 74% said yes, while in other stages it was only 17%. So they concluded that they had found the method to determine the incidence and duration of periods of dreaming. And this makes perfect sense. So REM sleep comes from rapid eye movements. So you have the eyes scanning the environment, the imaginary environment, and also it's called paradoxical sleep. Why? Because the EEG activity during the stage is very much like wakefulness. It looks on the EEG like wakefulness. And so their interpretation made sense. Now, when we look at REM sleep dreams, so indeed many studies have confirmed that when you wake up subject in the stage, they report dreams in about 80% of cases. They're vivid, they're hallucinatory, they're complex, they have a story. And we often think about how dreams are different from our waking experience, but one has to say, first of all, that in many ways they're very similar. If you look, for instance, at perceptual modalities in dreams, they're very similar to perceptual modalities in wakefulness. Almost 100% of dreams in REM sleep are visual, just like our waking experiences, followed by the auditory modality, somatosensory modality, and then only a small percentage of dream contains experiences of smell or taste, just like in our waking cognition. Then, I said it before, the sensory quality of experiences is quite clearly represented in dreams. When, for instance, we see a face in a dream, we really see it. We do not simply think about a face, we really see it. So you have this perceptual quality that is very similar. And then finally, you all know it, there's a big continuity between our dreaming and waking selves. In dreams, we see places where we have been before, we meet people that we know, not always, and they're often connected to unfamiliar things, but most of the time it is so. We have the same worries, etc. So there is a continuity. But then, as you all know, there are big differences also between waking cognition and dreaming. If you use clinical terms, dreams are actually hallucinations, so false perceptions. And they're also delusions, because while you dream, you have false beliefs. First of all, you don't realize that you're in your bed sleeping. You think you are somewhere else. And then you take the images that you see or the experience that you have for real, and they are not real. So you really also have a reflective consciousness that is reduced. Dreams have bizarre elements, impossible associations. And then there's also a quality that was described by Rechtschaffen in the 60s, that is the single-mindedness of dream. So when you dream, you usually tend to have a single train of thoughts. You have a very selective attention. You cannot multitask in a dream, so this is also a very particular characteristic. And it might relate to the fact that dream is a very pure form of imagination, and it's very difficult to imagine two things at the same time, or to imagine something and do something at the same time in the dream. Another important aspect is the high emotionality of dreams. Dreams are full of emotions, and some people even claim that during dreams you can attain a degree of emotion that you cannot attain during wakefulness, especially what concerns nightmares. And then this we also know, the memory for the dream and within the dream is severely altered. So most dreams are very rapidly forgotten. You probably all made the experience, you remember a dream upon waking up, you take a shower, you have breakfast, and you've already forgotten it. And sometimes during the day you experience something that reminds you of the dream, and then it sometimes comes back, but never as vivid in detail. So does this equation now really hold true? Does REM sleep equal dreaming? Well, there are some things that we have to consider that do not quite fit with this equation, is that some awakenings in REM sleep do not yield report of dream experiences, and this is also something that has been reproduced many times. Secondly, you can manipulate REM sleep, you can abolish REM sleep without actually affecting dreaming. And this has been shown different times. Then there are some brain lesions that interfere with dreaming without altering REM sleep. And then finally, dreaming is actually quite common in non-REM sleep. I will show you a graph here with the reported incidence of dreaming across studies and over the years, starting in the 1950s to the 1990s for REM sleep here and for non-REM sleep here. And you can see that for REM sleep, it has always been fairly constant, around 80%, while for non-REM sleep, in the early reports, it was only 20-30%, and then over the years, this incidence increased quite linearly. So what lies behind this increase? Of course, people don't dream differently now than they dreamed before. What actually changed is the way the experimenter asked the question to investigate about dreaming. Initially, they asked, did you have a dream, yes or no? And then over the years, they started to ask more open questions, like what was going through your mind before you woke up? And in this way, they were able to capture a much larger variety of experiences. Now, when we look at conscious experiences in non-REM sleep, 20 to 40% of awakenings yield unconsciousness. So when you wake up the subject, he or she will tell you, I did not experience anything at all. In 60 to 80%, well, it depends on the time of the night. When you wake them up early in the night, they will give you very short descriptions. They are very thought-like, and they sometimes don't even involve the self. It's just an image. Sometimes they will say, I think I dreamt of a phase, but it was very vague. They won't be able to tell you whether it was a woman or a man, who it was exactly. It's sometimes just very vague images. And then later in the night, they become longer, more hallucinatory, and towards the early morning hours, actually, they're quite undistinguishable from REM sleep dreams. And it's something that you can experience yourself when you participate in one of these experiences, and you're woken up several times of the night, and you're asked about your experiences, and then you learn whether you were woken up in REM sleep or non-REM sleep, most of the time you know that. You start to learn that very quickly. But the only time when you can really be wrong, and I've made the experience myself several times, is when you're woken up early in the morning in non-REM sleep, where they're really undistinguishable from REM sleep. They're the story-like vivid hallucinatory dreams. So this is just an example. Early in the night, I was thinking of a frying pan going hot on the stove, like when you cook something. So stage N2 at 1:25, and then later, same stage, but later in the morning, I was like directing some people and was trying to help them to keep the analysis inside the solar system. There was some danger of going outside the solar system, I guess. So the first image is just an image, very simple, and the second one is the delirious dream that very much resembles REM sleep dreaming, the dreams that we know of the early morning. So the fact that dreaming and unconsciousness can occur in two different states with very different EEG signatures has really puzzled researchers, and a lot of explanations have been proposed to reconcile these contradictory observations. So some people actually have, some researchers have suggested that maybe dreams are actually not experiences that occur during sleep, but that they are something that you make up when you wake up, that you confabulate. So others have thought, well, maybe there is no relation between EEG or brain activity and mental activity. Maybe this is a gap we can simply not bridge. And then some have suggested that maybe within non-REM sleep, you can have covered REM sleep intrusions that might account for the dreaming in this stage. What has happened till then? Well, we have made quite some progress. Regarding the slow waves of sleep, so the slow waves are the slow elements, the slow oscillations that you can see in the EEG of non-REM sleep. And when you look at what happens inside the thalamocortical neurons during slow waves, it's actually that they go into a rhythm where they go from a state, an on state, where they fire, and where the membrane potential is depolarized, to an off state, where they become silent. So they go into this rhythm on, off, on, off, on, off. And this is what you see here at the intracortical level. Now, what we also have realized is that the slow waves, so the hallmarks of sleep, and more generally non-REM sleep, they are not something that occurs in all the brain areas at the same time. As Professor Fried said yesterday, sleep is now considered to be a local phenomenon, especially the slow waves. So we've known for a long time that dolphins, for instance, they can sleep with one hemisphere at a time. We also know that the slow waves, they are not equally distributed across the cortical surface in adults, but for example, adults have a frontal maximum in amplitude of slow waves. And then the distribution of slow waves also depends on what you did, or better, what you learned during the day. This is a study that Huber did in Tononi's laboratory, where he had subjects practice a visual motor task that involved this cortical region. So they practiced this during the day, and then they learned it. And when they learned it, as opposed to when they did a similar task without a learning component, they observed a slow wave activity increase in the region that was involved in this task, so suggesting that really slow waves have a role in cerebral neural plasticity and in learning. And then there are states where you actually can have patterns of sleep and wakefulness at the EEG level at the same time, and these are typically sleep transitions, the waking up period, the falling asleep period, and then there are some extreme dissociations where you can be asleep and awake at the same time, which is, for instance, sleepwalking is a particular condition. What we've also seen is that slow waves that were initially thought to occur only non-REM sleep can actually occur in other states. So this is the study of Yuval Nir, who looked at intracranial recordings in humans, and he saw in non-REM sleep that slow waves are local. So here you have a slow wave with an off period that occurs in the left posterior cingulate, and nothing happens here in the right posterior cingulate, and a few seconds later you have the wave in the right posterior cingulate, but not in the left posterior cingulate. We now know that slow waves can also occur during wakefulness, especially in conditions of sleep deprivation, and I think we will learn that later. We will speak about this later today. And also in REM sleep, these are more recent findings where slow waves have been found to occur in superficial cortical layers in REM sleep, and only in primary cortical areas and not in secondary cortical areas. And this has been suggested as a mechanism that might underlie sensory disconnection during sleep. And then we also know that slow waves probably interfere with the generation of conscious experiences. So this is a study by Marcello Massimini, who used transcranial magnetic stimulation to induce slow waves. And what he saw is that when you use transcranial magnetic stimulation in wakefulness, you apply a pulse here at this level, then you see that the response really propagates very rapidly from one area to another. Well, when you do this in non-REM sleep, you evoke a slow wave, so you evoke a slow wave, and this slow wave really does not propagate at all. It stays there, it expands like an oil spot, as he says it, and the fact that the slow waves interfere with the communication or propagation of brain activity across cortical areas might be something that explains why consciousness is lost during sleep, because consciousness, at least on a theoretical level, seems to depend on integration of information between different areas. And then later the study has been replicated where an intracortical stimulation has been applied in patients undergoing recordings, pre-surgical recordings for epilepsy surgery, and they saw that they measured a phase locking index, so how much has the activity after the stimulation to do with what occurred before, with the stimulus, and what they saw that in wakefulness, well, the activity is very strongly locked to the stimulus, and then during sleep they observe a down state after the stimulus, and then the activity, the brain activity resumes, but it has nothing to do with the stimulus, so it loses the phase locking here, and so this is to say that the slow waves interfere with causal interactions between brain regions. And so the fact that slow waves really occur at the beginning of the night, where we have no experience at all or very short conscious experience, but they tend to be very small and rare at the end of the night, really also suggests that slow waves probably interfere with dreaming. Now, what does this all mean for the study of dreaming? So it means that we have to go from global to local. So we need to use techniques that really can capture the spatial distribution of slow waves with an increased spatial resolution. We have to go from between states to within comparisons. So we know that dreaming can occur in REM sleep, in non-REM sleep. So we have to stop comparing REM sleep and non-REM sleep, but we have to compare consciousness and consciousness within both states. And then the third thing is we have to carry many awakening per subjects, I think, to really appreciate the big diversity of the different dreams. And so this is what we tried to do in a study that we published 2 years ago with a group in Wisconsin, Giulio Tononi's group. So we used high-density EEG recordings, so 256 electrodes, to increase the spatial resolution of EEG, and we combined it simply with a serial awakening paradigm. We did 3 different experiments. First experiments, we had many subjects, but few awakenings per subject, and this was done in N2 and REM. And then a second experiment, we had 7 highly trained subjects who were undergoing many, many awakenings. And then a third experiment where, on the basis of the results of the first 2 experiments, we tried to predict dreaming in real time. So actually what we did, we woke up the subjects with a computerized alarm sound, and we asked them each time what was the last thing going through our mind prior to the alarm sound. And when the subjects could tell us something, we called this a dream experience. When he said there was nothing, we called this a no experience. And then you all know this category. Sometimes they were sure that they had dreamt something but could not remember any content. So we called this a dream experience without recall of content. Just to give you an example, this is a most recent conscious experience. I was thinking about perfume and fragrance. The very last word was fragrance. So this really shows that subjects, especially the highly trained ones, they were getting very good at remembering the last thing before the awakening. And in some instances, they could even tell you the last word they were thinking just before the awakening. So this is something you can clearly learn. And then, so the first thing we try to do is look at dream experiences and no dream experiences, or conscious experiences and unconsciousness. And we started with non-REM sleep. Why? Because the proportion of dreaming and no dreaming is very balanced in non-REM sleep. And we started with delta power. So delta power is the brain activity that reflects the slow waves. And we had a strong hypothesis about this. And indeed, we saw that in the 20 seconds before the awakening, slow waves were lower, so slow wave activity was lower when the subject reported an experience as opposed to when he did not report an experience. But maybe more surprisingly, we saw that this difference was not everywhere in the brain, but localized over a posterior brain region comprising a bit the visual areas, but also the precuneus, this part here extending to the medial parietal lobe. We call this the posterior hot zone. And quite surprisingly so, we found exactly the same thing for REM sleep. REM sleep, which is traditionally not associated with slow waves, where we know now that there can be slow waves. And then we also found the same thing when subjects said, yes, I was dreaming, but I don't remember anything. So this suggests that this is not necessarily related to dream recall, but probably more to having an experience, having a dream experience. And then we looked at high-frequency activity, gamma power, because gamma power is known to reflect neuronal firing. And here we saw that dream experiences were preceded by higher gamma power, again, mainly in posterior brain regions, but this time extending also more anteriorly in non-REM sleep, and in REM sleep it was much more diffuse. Then we also looked at what distinguishes the forgotten dreams from the recalled dreams. And here we saw a difference in gamma power, at least in non-REM sleep. And this difference was in anterior brain region. So in order to recall the content of the dream, you have to have an activation of these anterior brain regions, so prefrontal lobe, medial prefrontal lobe, also extending laterally to the prefrontal lobe. And then we also asked now, could the EEG tell us something about the content of the experience? So each time the subject had a conscious experience, a dream experience, we asked them first to evaluate the degree of thinking and perceiving. So thinking was defined as unrelated to any sensory stimulus, even imagined sensory stimulus, and perceiving was defined as strongly related to sensory stimulation. And so the subject had to give a rating, and then we compared the thought-like dreams with the perceptual dreams, and what we saw is, so this was done in REM sleep. All the content analysis was much easier to do in REM sleep. We saw that the perceptual aspects really correlates with a gamma activity in the posterior brain regions, so comprising the sensory areas, just like in wakefulness, and that the thinking really correlates with high-frequency activity in the anterior brain regions, also like wakefulness. And it was interesting to see that the thought-like mentation could be very abstract, even in REM sleep. Subject could have experiences like, for example, one subject told us, I think it sometimes pays to be wrong sometimes. And there could be very perceptual experience where subjects actually described looking at movies, looking at a publicity spot or something. So you really could tell the difference from the reports in the extreme cases. And then we also asked subject if in the very last image they had seen a face. And we compared dreams with faces and without faces. And we saw that just in the 2 seconds before the awakening, when there was a face, there was an activation of this area here. That is actually the fusiform face area that is specialized in the perception of faces also during wakefulness. We asked subject whether their dream had taken place indoors or outdoors. And sometimes they could not tell, actually. Sometimes there was no spatial setting. And we saw that when there was a spatial setting, there was an activation or increase in high-frequency activity in the right posterior parietal cortex, specifically on the right side. This is an area that is very important for spatial attention. And when you have a lesion here, it can lead to neglect, actually, spatial neglect. We also asked subjects, well, in the very last scene of the dream, did you move? And we expected actually to see that there were maybe premotor regions that were active when you were moving, but we did not observe that. We observed actually an activation of the posterior part of the superior temporal sulcus, which is a region in wakefulness that actually becomes active when you see other people move, not when you yourself move. So it was also interesting to see that the movements the subjects reported in dreams, they were never just moving the right hand. It would always bilateral movements, actually. And so in this respect, maybe dreams differ from waking movement experiences in a sense that dreaming are more about seeing yourself move than actually moving. Because in dreams, you don't move, actually. You just imagine the movement. And then one last question we asked is, well, did anyone speak in the last scene of your dream? And we saw that when this was the case, we saw an activation of Wernicke's area, so on the left side, so the area that is also important for speech perception. And this was actually quite interesting also. And then we asked now, can we predict what someone is dreaming based on these results? Not what someone, if someone's dreaming based on these results. And so Ben Baird, who is a postdoc in Giulio Tononi's lab, he carried out a third experiment where he had 7 new subjects come into the lab. They had around 60 electrodes, and we monitored the activity of the 3 posterior electrodes, or several posterior electrodes here, in real time. And first, the subjects came for a baseline night, where we just looked at their brain activity in general. And then we used this baseline night to determine thresholds, so low gamma and a low delta threshold, and the high gamma and the high delta threshold, set at 15% of the distribution. And then the next night, the subjects came back, and the algorithm that was reading the brain activity in real time initiated a dream prediction when the gamma was very high and the delta was very low in this zone, and the no dream prediction when it was the opposite. And overall, so they did 84 awakenings. They could only use 62 because of problems with artifacts that could not be cleared in real time. 36 of these were dream prediction, 26 were no dream prediction, and overall the total accuracy was 87%. So it seems that it's possible very broadly in non-REM sleep to tell, based on these results, if someone is dreaming or not. And then, how much time do I have? 10 minutes, okay. So I tried to be quick. And then we tried to go a step further in the last years. So instead of doing a spectral power analysis, we actually looked at slow waves, so individual slow waves. So we used algorithms that go through the signal and that detect these slow waves automatically, and that extract all the parameters associated with slow waves. So the amplitude, the ascending slope, the descending slope, the negative peaks, the positive peaks, etc. And then we looked how these slow wave parameters relate to dreaming. And so just to tell you that previously we had described 2 types of slow waves. We had characterized them in more detail. So ones that we call type 1 slow waves, and that comprise also K complexes that many of you know. So these are very big slow waves that can also be induced by external stimulation, and that have a very global component here. They're quite steep, they're quite broad, they have a big involvement. And then type 2 slow waves, which comprise the slow waves that we traditionally call delta waves, that are much more local, actually, and that have a smaller amplitude, smaller slopes. And we actually think that these 2 slow waves are generated by 2 different mechanisms. They both probably have off periods at the cortical level, but we think that one is generated in a bottom-up manner, and that is in relation with arousal systems. And we think that this other one is generated locally by local generators, which explains why they're relatively smaller and more local than the other one. And what we found actually is that dreaming was associated with this constellation. So in general, when few type 2 slow waves are around, and then when there are type 1 slow waves in the front, while no dream experiences are associated with type 2 slow waves that are very big. So type 2 slow waves are really the majority of slow waves. So when you do a power analysis, what actually comes out is a difference in slow wave activity power here in the back. And we also saw that the type 1 slow waves, the K complexes, frequently they're followed by a microarousal. This was already known. And we saw that when they are followed by a microarousal, this makes it actually more likely that you remember the content of your dream, as if there needs to be a short moment of local awakening in the frontal lobe to be able to consolidate the memory for the dream. We also looked at spindles and dream experiences in non-REM sleep, and we saw that actually, irrespective of the recall of the content, dream experiences are associated with faster spindles in posterior brain regions, so with more fast spindles and less slow spindles. And then we also had a look at REM slow waves, because we also had this finding of the posterior hot zone in REM sleep. And we just did a very general characterization of slow waves using high-density EEG. And in REM sleep also, we found two types of slow waves that spontaneously dissociated in space and have different characteristics. We saw frontocentral slow waves and a cluster of posterior slow waves. And the frontocentral slow waves have a broader involvement. They're actually what we call sawtooth waves normally in the EEG that we see. They're associated with eye movements, and they're actually also associated with an increase in gamma activity, in-phase increase in gamma activity, suggesting that they're actually activating frontocentral waves, while the other waves that we see in posterior regions, they're not associated with an increase in gamma. They're more similar to the other slow waves that we know from non-REM sleep. And we're actually trying to take this a step further to see how this relates to dreaming. So as a summary, if we can propose the Eeg correlates of dreaming, we saw that dreaming tends to occur when slow wave activity in posterior brain regions is low, and high frequency activity in the posterior brain regions and even beyond seems to mediate the dream contents. We also saw that it tends to be associated with fast spindles in this zone, and that there is a minority of very steep, large slow waves that resemble K-complexes, and maybe also the sawtooth waves, we will see, that are associated with dreaming, and that the dream recall actually is favored by microarousals that follow these types of waves in the front. So as a final conclusion, we saw that dreaming is associated with localized reduction of slow wave activity in posterior brain regions. This was consistent between three different experiments across states, non-REM sleep and REM sleep, and it allowed us to predict dreaming in real time in non-REM sleep. We saw that slow waves, especially the type 2 ones, so the majority, interfere with the generation of conscious experiences in sleep, especially when they occur in this posterior hot zone. And we think that this local correlate may actually explain why dreaming can occur both in REM sleep and non-REM sleep, two states with globally different signature. In other words, it doesn't matter whether in REM sleep and non-REM sleep, you can dream when your posterior brain regions are free of slow waves, in other words. We think that the recall of dream content, at least in non-REM sleep, appears to be favored by frontal activations in the form of microarousals. And we also saw that localized content-specific activations during sleep for faces, spatial setting, movement, and speech are similar to those engaged during waking perception of the same contents. And I think this is an argument to say, well, dreams are probably experiences that occur during sleep and are not something that you invent when you wake up or you make up. Otherwise, I think we would not have found this correlation with the brain activity during sleep. So finally, I'd like to finish by thanking my colleagues at the CHUV, at the University of Wisconsin, especially Professor Tononi, who led the study, and also my collaborators in Lausanne. So this is my group, who continues to work with me on dreams, and also my collaborator, Giulio Bernardi, who's in Italy now, who has his own group, but who has done all the slow wave work with me. The financial support, and thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, so we'll actually open this.